Hello everybody, it's the introverted astrologer here. I do hope that all of you are well, and I must thank you again for the many polite and lovely comments that you give me. I really appreciate it. As we get closer to the election, some of the comments are getting a little bit stressed, and so I really do notice those of you who remain civil and polite. Thank you so much. Now, we have a very busy week ahead. In the next few days, there's going to be a plethora of important planetary alignments, and astrologers everywhere have got their ears picked up. This is because we have a very intense full moon coming, and I suspect it's also going to ignite a potentially shocking transit in the USA's birth chart, its mundane chart. Countries have birth charts too, of course, and so in today's video we're going to be looking very closely at America's chart and the part of this chart that affects you, the people. Moreover, within a few days, America begins a new Mars cycle. I've had a look and I can see that this too is flagging up issues of you, the general public, and democracy in the States. And these developments are coming thick and fast as this full moon looms nearer. So let's go to the computer and take a look at what's going on. So let me start off by showing you what the forthcoming full moon looks like. You have the Placidus chart on the left and the whole sign chart on the right. And these charts are cast for the precise moment, or as near as we can get it to the minute, that we have the full moon over the skies of Washington, DC. This will be on the 19th of August in the early afternoon. There are a few reasons to be concerned about the full moon. You can see here the sun is caught up with a retrograde Mercury, and you can see here this near exact square to Uranus, and this is part of what makes this full moon so noteworthy. The basic impetus is speaking of sudden, startling change or shock. Uranus brings in events which are non-negotiable, they're jarring, they may potentially liberate us from a prior situation, but this is sometimes upsetting because a retrograde Mercury is involved too. There may be sudden dramatic news or reversals of decisions. We could be looking at reviews or reappraisals of earlier situations, of new information coming to light. You can see Saturn and Jupiter. They are forming their very first square aspect since their great conjunction back in 2020. That's a very important dynamic in itself, a major planetary cycle. But we can also see Mars and Jupiter conjunct together and in a T-square with this Saturn opposing Venus. And so there are quite a few major developments around this time in the full moon chart. This is not what today's video is about, but I just wanted to stress the intensity of this full moon, because what can often happen is that an intense full moon or new moon can actually bring the energy to trigger off important transits. And this is why I've brought the full moon chart up. You'll see red glyphs around this full moon chart, and these are the planets and points in America's own chart, the Independence chart. This is dated for the 4th of July 1776. And I want to take you down to the moon from America's natal chart. Can you see that the moon's position at the time of full moon is exactly in the area of America's own moon in the country's birth chart? It may well be that the energy coming in with this full moon triggers off a transit that we are expecting to America's natal chart, because the American moon is minutes away from experiencing a square transit from Uranus. Moreover, you can see that the Mars from America's chart is very near the Mars of the full moon chart, and this is because Mars is returning to the position it was in back in 1776. And so America is on the verge of a new Mars cycle. And these are the things that we will be looking at today. We're not going to look at the rest of this full moon too closely because we're now going to consider America's transits to its moon and the beginning of its new Mars cycle. So what we'll do now is take a look at the American independence chart in the centre, and we'll place the full moon chart around the outer edge. And here you can see that moon and the Uranus are kicking off a very close aspect to America's own moon, its mundane moon. Now, Uranus transits usually have to be in quite close aspect before they manifest. But as you can see, this Uranus is at 27 degrees and 11 of Taurus. And this is why I'm wondering if the energy of this full moon will actually kick off that American transit. Now, to understand what this transit could bring, we need to consider the significance of the moon in a nation's chart. The moon represents the people. It can also represent the principles of democracy. And so the general public and democracy are amongst its most well-known significances. To a lesser extent, we could consider issues relating to sea or water and to people who work in watery occupations, for example, the Navy. And there's a much lesser connection with issues like travel, crops, real estate and women. But most commonly, we tend to think of the mundane moon as being representative of the ordinary people, the general public, people like you and I, and issues of democracy. And transiting Uranus is about to place these issues under duress. There may be sudden unexpected events which throw these issues into turmoil. Is this turmoil going to be related to United States relationships with other countries? We could consider that because, of course, the Uranus in the independent chart is strong on the cusp of the 7th house. And the 7th house in a mundane chart represents the country's relationships with other nations, its friendly alliances, but also its enemies. Uranus can also represent power and authority in a mundane chart. And so we could anticipate foreign affairs to be a place where America is able to extend power and influence. Uranus really is the most unpredictable energy, and so it's very difficult to anticipate exactly how this will play out. But I do anticipate something unexpected or shocking within the next few weeks. Because Uranus will move retrograde and appear to move backwards, it will contact this moon again, and I'll set those dates out for you on the screen. Now, as mentioned, the Mars in this full moon is very close to America's mundane natal Mars, and so America is experiencing a new Mars return. And that Mars return will have some of the energy and the aspects of this full moon wrapped up in it, and so we'll take a look at that now. And so you can see here the central chart, which is the chart that is cast for the very minute that transiting Mars returns to the position it was in America's independence chart. You can see the planets from the independence chart placed around the outside of the circle in red. The reference place is Washington, D.C., and this chart is active for the period from 21st of August this year, 2024, until late July of 2026. So we're looking at a period of roughly 2 years. And of course, because this Mars return begins very shortly after that tumultuous full moon, we can see that the Sun has moved slightly away from its full moon position, although it is still in a square aspect with Uranus, and that the moon has changed position and is now in the very last minutes of Pisces. Now, this is a strong chart. We have planets on the angles, and Mars is actually in quite a tense position because of that conjunction with Jupiter and the simultaneous square out to Saturn and to the Venus too. So at this stage, let's stop and consider what Mars means in a country's birth chart. As you can imagine, the normal symbolisms of Mars remain to a certain extent. So we have that potential for initiatory action, for assertively pursuing our own aims and desires. but there is also that potential for aggression and violence. Mars can also be more broadly representative of soldiers, agitators and rioters, fires generally. Now, before we go any further, I am very concerned about adding to any of the conjecture or noise on YouTube and other sites about World War III. This isn't what today's video is about, and I'm not that kind of astrologer. I want to place things into context so as to minimise alarm. Because America will have a Mars return in just under every couple of years, America has had many Mars returns over the years, and in fact it's actually a rare year when America isn't caught up in military action of some sort somewhere in the world. I'm saying this because some of the aspects made in this new Mars return are indicative of dispute and challenge, and there is a potential for violence. But we are not talking about the worst violence America has experienced. And in fact, I'll wrap up this video with a few quick charts of years when there has been more intense military action or loss. I'd like to do that because I want to place today's video into context and not to worry you to death. This Aquarius ascendant is hinting at some change or disruption, possibly with issues relating to innovation, independence, potentially revolutionary themes. And the importance of these Aquarian themes are heightened because Uranus is very firmly on the angle of the chart which represents the 4th house. This is a house which is caught up with the people of the land, the general public and democracy. Perhaps now you can also see why I am concentrating on Uranus during this video. Not only is the American chart going to have a stressful Uranus transit to its natal moon, but the Mars return is also flagging up Uranian themes. This Uranus strong on the 4th house cusp does have some overlap in principle with the idea of today's transit in Uranus entering closer and closer to that square with the American moon. The moon and the 4th house have some things in common because the moon rules Cancer. Cancer is the 4th sign of the zodiac. And so we're seeing the emphasis of a particular principle here, which is some change or disruption that the American people may not welcome. Something which is potentially a change or a shift, which could be challenging. Another strong position is that of Pluto on the ascendant, and Pluto brings in the energies of transformation and overhaul. It does also bring in issues of power and control, and so the trine to Uranus is suggestive that some overall control or change is introduced during this 2-year period. Perhaps there is a need to gain control over issues to do with disruption. Uranus can be the rebel, the revolutionary, and is a planet which insists on freedom. Pluto is suggesting that these urges are brought under control, and we can also note that Pluto is the modern-day ruler of Scorpio, which is the 10th house, the house of government, of those who are in authority. And we can also see that the ascendant of this Mars return falls into the 3rd house of America's independence chart. And so issues relating to information, to mass media, to communication networks and potentially travel will be especially prominent during this 2-year cycle. And of course, the way that information is disseminated now includes a very popular use of social media. And so the spreading of news by social media too could also be particularly relevant during these next couple of years. Now let's focus on the planet that this is all about, which is that Mars. We can see Jupiter nearby is very much enlarging these energies, and there is that square with Saturn and Venus bringing in that T-square pattern to this chart. Mars and Jupiter together represent an enlarging or an exaggeration of all things connected with Mars, and so we're looking at issues of action, of assertion and potentially of conflict This is because of those difficult aspects that are being made out to Saturn and to Venus. Mars-Saturn aspects in particular are one of the hallmarks of conflict. You could also argue that there is a wider square between Mars and the Moon-Neptune conjunction. Some of the traditional interpretations for Mars-Jupiter in square to Saturn would include the word war. However, this word may well bring to mind visions of large international battles, and in this case it may well be that these are internal battles fought within the United States, and ones that are indeed unfortunate for government, because these same aspects also include the potential for discontent generally, perhaps for turbulence, and we could also consider riots. The fact that Jupiter is involved is also hinting at unrest or discontent in relation to ideology or belief systems, possibly religion, but certainly belief systems. This square to Venus is also possibly speaking of discontent and anger over the nation's spending, over its spending on other countries. Venus often refers to a nation's finances, and in the 8th house and conjunct to Neptune could indicate issues around these finances. The square to Mars potentially is speaking of dissatisfaction around foreign spending, and the opposition to Saturn in the 2nd house of national revenues may indicate that money becomes shorter and is a source of anger and of discontent. Now, the 5th house placement of this Mars-Jupiter conjunction is interesting because the 5th mundane house is all about how a nation entertains itself, its creative pastimes. We're looking at sports, concerts, how we enjoy ourselves, and also of our children and our pleasures. Sometimes a prominent public figure can die when we find Mars receiving negative aspects and placed in the 5th house. I'd like to return to the moon in this chart, the significator of the people and democracy. America's natal moon is in Aquarius, so we could think of a people who are broad-minded, forward-thinking, stubborn, intelligent. We could anticipate visionary qualities which are open to the advancement of things which will benefit humanity. Aquarian people may be very humanitarian. If we look at the moon in this return chart, however, there is a near exact conjunction with Neptune, and they are both at 29 degrees. This is a very watery looking moon. It's too watery, and the 29th degree of any sign can sometimes hint at instability. To not only have the moon in Pisces, which is a water sign, but to have Neptune, the ruler of that water sign, in the same degree is an overemphasis which is making me a little uneasy. Are we being shown that the principles of democracy are being threatened or diluted? The moon, after all, is speaking of democracy, and the moon is a very fast-moving body in comparison to the other planets. And so when it forms close aspects like this, it's important. There is also the almost exact inconjunct to the sun in the chart. A mundane sun speaks of heads of state, government, people in authority, people with ultimate control. And so we're seeing some separation away from the government, and that this separation will not be wholly pleasant for government. We can also see that the midheaven of America's mundane independence chart is very closely opposing this Moon-Neptune conjunction, again reinforcing those other energies in the chart which are speaking of the people and democracy coming under big pressure. Are the principles of democracy being threatened or diluted? Moon-Neptune of itself indicates secrets, possibly hidden crimes, potentially scandal, but it is also hinting that democracy and political parties are subject to unfortunate pressure. This conjunction is also taking place on a fixed star which is called Skeet. Now, the old-fashioned meaning of Skeet is quite frightening because of its connection with great misfortune, suicide, drowning, being murdered. But skeet can also be interpreted in a more modern way, where we would consider the nature of a people. And in this case, we are looking at a people who would be headstrong, willful, with great changeability. And that in conjunct to the sun is suggesting a drift between these people, between democracy and rulership. And in short, there could be increasing disharmony between people and rulers. And so I can't tell you exactly how all these energies will play out. I think there is tension and conflict. This year's elections are certainly showing up the issues of increasing polarisation and division, and illustrating the intense pressure that democracy is being placed under. I can see some financial pressures here, and that these too will be the source of discontent, anger. There are challenges to democracy. We can also note that transiting Neptune at the moment is somewhere around the last degree of Pisces, but from next year it will enter early Aries, which will mean that it is opposing the midheaven. And so we know that this transit is coming and that this may not be easy. But we can also see that these issues are kept under control through the Pluto, that important agreements may be made, and that some of the more unfortunate energies in this chart are contained in a structured and purposeful way that does indeed help the American nation move forward. So the last part of this video is just involving the quickest of looks at a few times when there have been larger formal wars going on. And so if we look at the chart for World War II, for example, you can see Mars here, very strong on an angle. There is a square to Neptune. In fact, the United States was having its Neptune return at the time. We can see the square between the Pluto and a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction here. And the energies here are more sinister, ruthless, and heavy. The chart for World War I places Mars in the 12th house. And there is an extremely tight square forming with Chiron and hinting at the wound and suffering that this war brought. We do see Pluto on the ascendant, just like with our Mars return for 2024. But in this case, there are more stressful contacts out to Jupiter, and we have Saturn nearby. Pluto and Saturn together is a very difficult combination of energy, as you may recall from the coronavirus outbreak. And in this case, that Cancer ascendant is drawing in America's Venus and Jupiter, which are in Cancer. And so the overall planetary alignment is much more intense than we are seeing in our 2024 chart. The outbreak of the Civil War did see a Mars-Jupiter conjunction. In this chart, it's placed in the 12th house. America's natal sun, representative of governments and rulers, falls near the ascendant of this chart. We can see some similarities with our 2024 chart if we look at the approaching Moon-Neptune conjunction, again in the sign of Pisces, and being brought to prominence around the midheaven area. Pluto and Saturn are again rearing their heads, this time in a very tight square. This energy is dark and deep and speaks of a merciless tearing down of structures. And finally, the Iraq War features a Mars which is in the 11th house and has the node and Saturn nearby. So there is this conjunction with Saturn and Mars, which does so often hint at conflict. However, we do also have that opposition with Pluto. America's natal Chiron would be placed up here on the midheaven of the chart, and the node on the ascendant could be speaking of those alliances or cooperation with other nations in this war. What I'm driving at by showing you these war charts is that they tend to be a little bit more intense than America's forthcoming Mars return. And so although we can see the signs of unrest and conflict, this is not worst case scenario, and the seeds of this may well be staring us in the face already. I hope you can understand what I meant when I said that the people and democracy is coming under some pressure. At the same time, I don't think anybody benefits from catastrophizing or dreading the future. Now I will be re-uploading a video shortly after this one. It's the video where I have a closer look at Kamala Harris's converse progressions around election time. It was very badly edited on my part and I hadn't appreciated quite how badly. So I'm re-uploading this video, and this time I'm adding a decent conclusion to it. That conclusion is still the same. My opinion is that Kamala Harris has a strong chance of winning the election, and that her position is stronger than Donald Trump's around the 5th of November. So please don't watch it again unless you just simply want to double check my conclusion. And until next time, as always, God bless you all and take care.